Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. The sky above Montreal was a soft gray canvas, the kind that held the promise of snow but seemed hesitant to let it fall. The city bustled beneath its winter veil, a symphony of car engines, laughter, and the occasional bark of a dog echoing against the stone facades of old buildings. Among the crowd of bundled-up pedestrians, Sophie Leclerc walked briskly, her breath puffing out in little clouds, her hands tucked deep into the pockets of her crimson coat. Sophie loved this time of year. The twinkling fairy lights strung across the streets, the warm aroma of freshly baked croissants wafting from corner boulangeries, and the infectious energy of a city gearing up for the holidays. But today her thoughts were far from festive. Her mind churned over the email she had received that morning, a summons to meet with an old acquaintance who had resurfaced after nearly a decade. Lucas Thorne. The name alone stirred a dozen emotions she had long buried. They had been inseparable once, two dreamers chasing the stars in a small coastal town before life's currents pulled them in opposite directions. She had heard snippets of his life from mutual friends, his success as a travel photographer, his whirlwind adventures across continents. And now, out of the blue, a simple message: let's meet. There's something I need to tell you. She turned a corner onto Saint-Denis Street, her boots crunching against a patch of snow. The cafe he had chosen was quaint and understated, its name Le Rêveur, the dreamer, painted in delicate cursive on the glass door. Sophie hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, the bell above the door chiming softly to announce her arrival. The interior was warm, a stark contrast to the chill outside. It was a place where time seemed to slow down. Wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and bookshelves crammed with novels and trinkets. A soft hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine created an inviting ambiance. And there, in a corner booth by the window, was Lucas. He looked up as she approached, his face breaking into a smile that hadn't changed since they were 17. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, his cheeks dusted with a hint of stubble. But it was his eyes that caught her off guard, a stormy blue that seemed to hold both the weight of his travels and the boyish charm she remembered. "Sophie," he said, standing to greet her. His voice was softer than she remembered, but it carried the same warmth. "You look exactly the same." "And you look like you've lived 100 lifetimes," she replied, her tone teasing but her smile genuine. They hugged briefly, an awkward gesture that felt both strange and comforting. As they settled into their seats, Lucas ordered for them. Black coffee for him, a lavender latte for her, just as she'd always liked. The gesture didn't go unnoticed, and she found herself wondering how much he still remembered about the girl she used to be. "So," she began, her curiosity getting the better of her, "what brings you back to Montreal? And why now?" Lucas hesitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. "I've been thinking a lot about the past lately. About us, and there's something I've been carrying that I need to let go of." The weight in his words silenced her playful banter. She leaned forward slightly, her brows knitting together. "Go on," she urged. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his coffee. "Do you remember the night we snuck out to watch the meteor shower? The one where we made a pact to always tell each other the truth, no matter what?" Sophie nodded, the memory vivid and bittersweet. They had been reckless and young, lying on the hood of his old car, staring up at a sky ablaze with falling stars. "I broke that promise," Lucas admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was something I didn't tell you back then, something that could have changed everything." Her heart raced as a dozen possibilities swirled in her mind. "Lucas, what is it?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He hesitated before sliding it across the table to her. "Read this," he said. Sophie unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was an old letter, the edges worn, the ink slightly faded. As her eyes scanned the words, her breath hitched. It wasn't just any letter. It was a love letter, one she had written to him but never sent. A letter confessing feelings she had been too scared to voice. "How did you?" she began, her voice cracking. "You left it in my car that night," Lucas explained. "I found it after you'd gone home. I wanted to tell you I felt the same, but I was scared. Scared it would ruin what we had. Scared it wouldn't be enough." Sophie's mind reeled. She had long since made peace with the idea that her feelings for Lucas had been one-sided, a youthful infatuation, and now to learn he had known all along that he had felt the same. "Why now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Lucas's eyes met hers, raw and unguarded. "Because life is too short for regrets, and I can't keep wondering what might have been." The cafe seemed to fade away, the sounds muffled, the people blurred. It was just the two of them, suspended in a moment heavy with unspoken possibilities. And as Sophie searched his face for answers, she realized she was standing at a crossroads she had never anticipated. But just as she opened her mouth to respond, a voice interrupted. "Excuse me, miss," a stranger said, tapping her shoulder. Sophie turned, startled, to find a delivery man holding a bouquet of white lilies. "Are you Sophie Leclerc?" "Yes," she replied, confusion lacing her tone. The man handed her the flowers along with a small envelope. "These are for you. Have a nice day." As he walked away, Sophie opened the envelope with shaky hands. Inside was a single card with a message scrawled in elegant handwriting. "Sometimes the truth arrives too late." She looked up to find Lucas gone. Only his untouched coffee remained, a faint wisp of steam curling above the cup. For a moment, she thought she had imagined the entire encounter, but the letter in her hand said otherwise. Her world tilted, the lines between past and present blurring in a way that left her breathless and uncertain. And as she sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the cafe, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that some stories weren't meant to have an ending. Chapter 2: Whispers of the Past. Sophie sat frozen in the cafe, the lilies trembling in her grip. The soft hum of conversation around her seemed distant, as though she were trapped behind an invisible wall. The cryptic message on the card burned in her mind. Sometimes the truth arrives too late. She glanced out the window, scanning the street for any sign of Lucas, but the snow had begun to fall in thick, lazy flakes, obscuring the faces of passers-by. He was gone, as if he'd been a ghost all along. Her gaze dropped to the letter still clutched in her other hand. The words she had written all those years ago now felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. "Dear Lucas," it began, "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I can't keep these feelings locked away any longer." She hadn't even signed her name, too scared of what the truth might bring. The idea that Lucas had kept it all these years sent a shiver down her spine. But why had he returned it only to vanish? And what did he mean by his confession? The barista called her name, breaking the spell. Sophie blinked, realizing her lavender latte had been sitting on the counter for several minutes. She stood, collecting the drink and the bouquet before heading toward the door. The cold air bit her cheeks as she stepped outside. She lingered for a moment, hoping Lucas might reappear, but the street was a blur of faces and swirling snow. With a sigh, she began walking toward her apartment, her thoughts tangled in a web of memories and questions. That night, Sophie sat by the window of her tiny apartment, the lilies arranged in a vase on the table beside her. She traced her finger along the edge of the card, her mind replaying every detail of the encounter. Her phone buzzed, jolting her out of her reverie. It was a message from Emma, her best friend since childhood. "Heard about your mysterious reunion. Spill everything." Sophie hesitated before typing back. "It was strange. He said he wanted to tell me something important, but left before I could ask anything. He gave me a letter I wrote years ago but never sent." The reply came almost instantly. "What letter?" "The one I wrote to Lucas when I was in love with him." There was a long pause before Emma replied again. "Sophie, are you sure? Because I was the one who found that letter in your desk drawer after you moved. You told me you'd never given it to him." Sophie stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. "I'm sure. He had it with him. He said I left it in his car the night of the meteor shower." "I'm coming over." 15 minutes later, Emma was at Sophie's door, her face pale against her dark scarf. She wasted no time settling into a chair and grabbing the letter from Sophie's hands. "You're telling me Lucas had this?" Emma asked, holding it up. Sophie nodded. "He said he found it that night, that he wanted to say something but didn't." Emma frowned, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "That doesn't make sense. This letter was in your room when we packed everything up after high school, I'm certain of it. Sophie felt a cold knot form in her chest. Are you saying what? That Lucas lied? That someone else gave it to him? I don't know, Emma admitted, placing the letter back on the table, but something doesn't add up. Before Sophie could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. The message was short but sent chills down her spine. Unknown, meet me at the clock tower. Midnight. Who is it? Emma asked, leaning closer. I don't know, Sophie whispered, showing her the screen. Emma's eyes widened. You're not seriously thinking about going, are you? Sophie bit her lip, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to leave the mysteries of the day unanswered. But another part of her, the part still aching with questions, couldn't resist. I have to, she said finally. At midnight, the clock tower stood shrouded in snow, its silhouette looming against the night sky. Sophie wrapped her coat tighter around herself as she approached, her breath visible in the frigid air. The square was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of her boots on the snow. She scanned the area, but no one was there. Hello? She called, her voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It wasn't Lucas. It was a woman. Tall and elegant, her sharp features illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. Her dark coat flared out slightly as she moved, giving her an almost ghostly appearance. You're Sophie Leclerc, the woman said, her voice low and melodic. Yes, Sophie replied, her throat dry. Who are you, and what do you want? The woman's lips curved into a faint smile. I'm someone who has been watching this story unfold for far too long. Lucas never had the letter. He couldn't have because... She paused, her eyes glinting with an unsettling intensity. Because he's been dead for 7 years. Sophie felt the ground tilt beneath her. That's impossible, she managed, her voice trembling. I saw him. I spoke to him today. The woman tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. Did you? Or did you see what you wanted to see? Before Sophie could respond, the woman turned and began walking away, her figure disappearing into the swirling snow. Sophie called after her, but the woman didn't stop. Left alone in the freezing night, Sophie clutched the letter in her pocket, her heart pounding with questions that seemed destined to remain unanswered. And above her, the clock struck 12. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Snow. The clock tower's chime echoed into the night, each toll reverberating in Sophie's chest like a haunting reminder of her unraveling reality. She stood frozen, the woman's words circling her mind like vultures. Lucas has been dead for 7 years. It couldn't be true. She had seen him, spoken to him, felt the warmth of his presence just hours ago, yet the certainty in the woman's tone left a gnawing doubt that Sophie couldn't shake. The cold began to seep into her bones, snapping her out of her daze. She needed answers. The walk back to her apartment was a blur, her thoughts darting between memories of Lucas and the enigma of the woman's claim. By the time Sophie reached her apartment, Emma was waiting for her in the kitchen, a mug of tea in hand. She jumped to her feet the moment Sophie stepped inside. Well, what happened? Emma asked, her eyes wide with concern. Sophie sank into a chair, her hands trembling as she recounted the encounter by the clock tower. When she finished, Emma stared at her, stunned. That's insane, Emma said finally. Lucas can't be dead. You talked to him. I know what I saw, Sophie replied, her voice barely a whisper. But what if she was telling the truth? Emma set her mug down with a sharp clink. Okay, let's not jump to conclusions. If Lucas is dead, there would be a record of it, right? We can look it up. Sophie hesitated. The idea of confirming the woman's claim felt like stepping off a cliff, but she nodded. Fine, let's do it. An hour later, Sophie sat hunched over her laptop, the dim glow of the screen the only light in the room. Emma was beside her, scrolling through search results, and then they found it. Lucas Thorne, obituary. Born July 12, 1993, died November 17, 2017. The accompanying photo was unmistakable. Lucas, his stormy blue eyes staring back at her, the same eyes she had looked into that very afternoon. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, a strangled sound escaping her throat. No, she whispered, shaking her head. This can't be real. Emma read aloud, her voice trembling. Lucas Thorne, a renowned travel photographer, passed away in a tragic accident while hiking in Banff National Park. He is remembered for his adventurous spirit and his ability to capture the beauty of the world through his lens. Sophie pushed the laptop away, her chest tightening. How could I have seen him if he's been dead for years? Emma placed a hand on her shoulder. Maybe someone's playing a sick joke, or maybe you were mistaken. It's possible, right? Sophie shook her head. No, it was him, Emma. He knew things only Lucas could know. He had the letter. Emma opened her mouth to argue, but stopped when she saw the look in Sophie's eyes. Okay, she said softly. If you believe it was him, then we'll figure out what's going on. The next day, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It began as she walked to work, the prickling sensation on the back of her neck. She turned several times, scanning the street, but saw nothing unusual. By the time her shift at the bookstore ended, her nerves were frayed. She decided to take a detour home, cutting through a quiet park to avoid the bustling streets. The snow muffled her footsteps, the silence almost oppressive. Halfway through the park, she heard it, the crunch of footsteps behind her. Sophie's heart raced. She quickened her pace, her breath visible in short puffs. The footsteps grew louder, matching her speed. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaky. The footsteps stopped. She turned slowly, her eyes darting through the dimly lit park. At first, there was nothing but the skeletal branches of trees and the faint glow of streetlights. Then a shadow shifted. "Hello, Sophie," a voice said, low and familiar. Her breath caught. Lucas stepped out from the shadows, his expression calm, but his eyes filled with something unplaceable. Regret, sorrow, or perhaps something darker. "You." She stumbled over her words, her mind struggling to reconcile what she was seeing. "You're supposed to be dead." "I know," he said simply, his voice steady. "And I am." Her legs felt like jelly, and she gripped a nearby tree for support. "This can't be happening." "It is," he said, stepping closer. "I came back because there's something you need to know, something I couldn't tell you before." Sophie shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." Lucas stopped a few feet away, his gaze locking onto hers. "I'm as real as the memories we share, Sophie, and I'm here because you deserve the truth." She stared at him, her chest heaving. "What truth? Why now?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "The night of the meteor shower, something happened, something I never told you, and now I don't have much time left." His words sent a chill down her spine, colder than the winter air. "What do you mean?" Lucas took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are things in this world we don't understand, Sophie. Doors that shouldn't be opened, choices that can't be undone." Her mind reeled, the weight of his words pulling her deeper into confusion and fear. But before she could ask more, a sudden gust of wind swept through the park, scattering snow and obscuring her vision. When it cleared, Lucas was gone. Sophie stumbled home, her thoughts a chaotic storm. That night, as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "Unknown. Find the red door. It's the only way to end this." Beneath the message was a photo of an old, weathered door with a brass handle and the number 17 etched into the frame. Sophie stared at it, her heart pounding. She didn't know where the door was or what awaited her on the other side, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. Chapter 4: The Red Door. The photograph of the red door haunted Sophie, even as the first rays of dawn seeped through her window. Sleep had eluded her, her mind consumed by the mystery and dread surrounding Lucas's return and the cryptic instructions. She sat at the kitchen table, clutching a steaming mug of coffee, the phone with the photo lying face up beside her. Emma arrived minutes later, still in her pajamas, her hair pulled into a hasty ponytail. "You look awful," Emma said, dropping into a chair. "Thanks," Sophie muttered. "I didn't sleep." Emma glanced at the phone, frowning. "That's the red door? What's it supposed to mean?" "I don't know," Sophie replied. "Her voice need to find it." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's a good idea? You don't know who's sending these messages? Or why?" Sophie's gaze hardened. "I don't have a choice. Lucas said there's something I need to know, and this might be the only way to find out." Emma sighed. "Fine, but if you're going on a wild goose chase, I'm coming with you." The search for the red door took them across the city, from cobblestone alleys to forgotten neighborhoods. Armed with the photo and a mounting sense of urgency, Sophie and Emma knocked on doors and questioned locals. But no one seemed to recognize the distinctive frame or the etched number 17. Hours passed, and the sky began to darken. Sophie felt the weight of despair settling over her. She leaned against a lamppost in a quiet side street, the snow crunching beneath her boots. "This is hopeless," she murmured. Emma, scrolling through her phone, suddenly froze. "Wait, look at this." She turned the screen toward Sophie, revealing a photo of an abandoned building on a neighborhood forum. The description read, "Forgotten relic of the old district, rumored to be haunted, distinctive red door at the rear." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "Where is it?" "Edge of the city," Emma replied, pointing to the map attached to the post. "It's a long walk, but we can make it." The building stood at the end of a desolate street, its facade crumbling and windows boarded up. Snow covered the steps leading to the entrance, but it was the rear of the structure that drew Sophie's attention. There it was, the red door. It looked exactly like the photo, weathered and ominous, with the brass handle tarnished by time. The number 17 was etched into the wood, faint but unmistakable. Emma hesitated. "Are we really doing this?" Sophie nodded, her resolve firm. "I have to." She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling. The metal was cold, almost biting, as she turned it and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and dust. The room beyond the door was dimly lit by a single bulb swaying gently from the ceiling. A spiral staircase led downward, its iron railing twisting into darkness. Emma grabbed Sophie's arm. "Are you sure about this? We could just leave." "I can't," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Without waiting, she descended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. Emma followed reluctantly, her footsteps hesitant. The staircase ended in a narrow corridor, its walls lined with flickering candles. At the end of the corridor was another door, smaller and unmarked. Sophie pushed it open, her breath hitching. The room was unlike anything she'd expected. It was circular, its walls covered in photographs, hundreds of them. Sophie stepped closer, her heart pounding as she recognized the subjects, herself and Lucas. There were photos from their childhood, candid moments from high school, even snapshots of the night of the meteor shower. But there were others, too, images she had never seen before. Photos of her in the present day, walking to work, sitting in her apartment, standing in the park the night before. Emma gasped. "What the hell is this?" Sophie's hands trembled as she reached for a photo of Lucas, his face illuminated by the light of a fire. He looked older, weary, as though he had aged years in the span of days. Before she could process it, a voice spoke from behind them. "You shouldn't have come here." They spun around to see the woman from the clock tower standing in the doorway, her dark coat blending into the shadows. "You," Sophie whispered, "what is this place? What do you want from me?" The woman stepped into the room, her expression unreadable. "This is where the truth resides, but it's not the truth you think you want." Sophie clenched her fists. "Stop speaking in riddles. Tell me what's going on." The woman's gaze softened, almost pitying. "Lucas isn't the man you remember. When he died, he made a choice that brought him back, but not entirely. What you've been seeing is a shadow of him, tied to this place." Emma grabbed Sophie's arm. "We need to leave. Now." But Sophie shook her head, her eyes locked on the woman. "What kind of choice?" The woman sighed. "He gave up his rest to protect you, Sophie. There are forces in this world that feed on unresolved emotions, on love that lingers beyond death. Lucas returned to shield you from them, but his time is running out." The candles flickered, the shadows in the room growing darker and more oppressive. Sophie felt a chill creep over her, like unseen hands pressing against her skin. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice breaking. The woman stepped closer, placing a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "You must sever the bond, let him go, fully and completely. Only then will he be free." Sophie's throat tightened. "But if I do that, he'll be gone forever." The woman nodded. "It's the only way to save him, and yourself." The room grew colder, the photos on the walls trembling as if caught in an invisible wind. Sophie turned to Emma, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," Emma said, gripping her shoulders. "You have to." Sophie closed her eyes, her mind filled with memories of Lucas, the sound of his laugh, the warmth of his touch, the way he had looked at her as though she were the only person in the world. She whispered, I'm sorry, Lucas. I love you. The room shook, the candles extinguishing one by one. A faint figure appeared in the center of the room, shimmering like smoke. Lucas? He smiled at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, he said softly, his voice echoing as his form began to dissolve. Be happy, Sophie. And then he was gone. Sophie collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Emma knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her. The room fell silent, the air growing still. The photos were gone, the walls blank and unremarkable. But Sophie knew she would never forget. Chapter 5, Fractured Reflections. The days after Lucas's final farewell passed in a haze. Sophie felt hollow, as though a part of her had been carved away, leaving an aching void. Emma stayed close, her presence a quiet comfort as Sophie navigated her grief. But the world didn't stop. The bookstore needed her. Rent had to be paid. Sophie went through the motions, her mind often wandering to the red door and the mysterious woman who had forced her to confront an impossible truth. One evening, Sophie was tidying the shop when she noticed something strange. A book had fallen from the shelf, lying open on the floor. She bent to pick it up, her eyes catching on the page. The words weren't ordinary text. They were names, written in looping, ethereal script, each accompanied by a date and a short description. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the name at the bottom of the page. Lucas Thorne, November 17th, 2017. Gave his light to protect a loved one. The book pulsed in her hands, the faint scent of ozone filling the air. What are you? She whispered. Something you shouldn't meddle with, a voice replied. Sophie spun around to see the woman from the clock tower standing in the doorway. Her dark coat seemed to absorb the dim light, her presence both commanding and unsettling. You again, Sophie said, her voice sharp with a mixture of fear and anger. Why are you here? The woman stepped closer, her expression calm but firm. Because you've crossed into a realm you don't understand. That book isn't meant for you. Sophie clutched the book tighter. Then why did it find me? The woman sighed, her gaze softening. Because your connection to Lucas left a mark. One that lingers even now. Sophie's grip faltered, her mind reeling. What does that mean? I thought letting him go was the end. It should have been, the woman said. But sometimes bonds forged in love don't break so easily. The woman led Sophie to the back of the shop, where the air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. She waved a hand, and a ripple passed through the room, revealing a hidden door in the wall. This is the true end, the woman said. If you wish to sever the mark completely, you must step through and face what lies beyond. Sophie hesitated, her heart pounding. What's on the other side? Reflection, the woman replied, and a choice. Emma appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Sophie, you don't have to do this. We can leave this all behind. Sophie turned to her, tears brimming in her eyes. I can't keep running, Emma. I need to finish this. Emma opened her mouth to protest, but stopped, seeing the determination in Sophie's face. Fine, but I'm coming with you. The woman shook her head. She cannot follow. This journey is yours alone. Sophie glanced at Emma, who gave her a reluctant nod. Be careful, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie took a deep breath and stepped through the door. The world beyond was unlike anything Sophie had ever seen. It was a vast expanse of mirrored surfaces, each reflecting not just her image, but fragments of her life, moments she had lived, decisions she had made, and paths she had not taken. In the center of the space stood a figure, Lucas. But he wasn't the Lucas she remembered. This version of him was fractured, his form flickering as though caught between worlds. Sophie, he said, his voice layered with echoes. She stepped closer, her heart aching at the sight of him. Lucas, what is this place? This is where all choices converge, he said, where the truth of who we are is laid bare. I let you go, she said, her voice trembling. Why are you still here? He smiled sadly. Because part of me never left. I couldn't, not entirely. Sophie's eyes filled with tears. What do I have to do? Lucas gestured to the mirrors around them. You must see yourself as you are, every flaw, every fear, every regret. Only then can you break the bond. The mirrors shimmered, each one showing a different version of Sophie. Her as a child, her with Lucas, her alone and broken. She saw herself happy, sad, angry, and afraid. It was overwhelming. I can't, she whispered, turning away. Yes, you can. Lucas said, stepping closer. Because you're stronger than you think. You've always been stronger than me. His words gave her the courage to turn back. Slowly, she faced each mirror, letting the reflections wash over her. She saw the nights she had doubted herself, the times she had hurt others without meaning to, and the moments when she had been kind and brave. Finally, she stood before the largest mirror, its surface blank. Her reflection appeared, her current self, worn but determined. Lucas stood beside her, his form steady now. This is the final step. You must forgive yourself, for everything. Only then will the mark fade. Sophie stared at her reflection, the weight of her life pressing down on her. But as she looked deeper, she saw not just her flaws, but her strength, her resilience, and her capacity for love. I forgive you. She whispered to herself. The mirror shattered, the shards dissolving into light. Lucas smiled, his form beginning to fade. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with peace. And then he was gone, truly this time. Sophie awoke on the floor of the bookstore, the hidden door gone. Emma was beside her, shaking her awake. You're back, Emma said, relief flooding her face. Sophie sat up, her chest feeling lighter than it had in years. For the first time, she felt free. The red door, the woman, and the mirrored realm were gone, but Sophie knew they had left an indelible mark on her. She had faced her past, her fears, and her love for Lucas, and now she was ready to move forward. Final chapter. The light beyond the door. Winter's grip on the city began to loosen, the snow melting into rivulets that trickled along the cobblestone streets. Life moved on, as it always did, but Sophie carried a sense of stillness within her, a calm that hadn't existed before. Weeks had passed since the red door and the final goodbye. The woman from the clock tower had vanished, the mysterious book had disappeared from the store, and Sophie had stopped searching for answers. But one thing lingered, the sense of a new beginning. It was a crisp spring morning when Sophie woke to find a letter slipped beneath her apartment door. Her name was written in a familiar hand, one she hadn't seen in years. Lucas. Her breath caught as she opened the envelope, her fingers trembling. Inside was a single piece of paper, blank except for 4 words written in the center. Find the light within. The message wasn't ominous or heavy. It felt like a gentle nudge, a reminder of something she already knew but had yet to accept. That day, Sophie returned to the park where she and Lucas had spent so many of their evenings. The air smelled of damp earth and budding flowers. She sat on their favorite bench, closing her eyes and letting the warmth of the sun wash over her. It was there, in the quiet of the morning, that she realized what the message meant. Lucas wasn't asking her to hold on to him. He was urging her to find her own path, to live fully and love deeply, not despite the loss she had endured, but because of it. Sophie began to rebuild her life with intention. She expanded the bookstore, turning it into a community space where people could gather for readings and workshops. She reconnected with old friends and forged new relationships, including one with a quiet, kind-hearted man named Daniel, who shared her love for literature and brought a steady warmth into her life. At first, she felt guilty moving on, as though it were a betrayal of Lucas. But over time, she understood that honoring his memory didn't mean remaining trapped in the past. It meant carrying his love with her as she stepped into the future. On the 1-year anniversary of the night she had severed the bond, Sophie returned to the site of the red door. The building had been demolished, replaced by an empty lot where wildflowers grew in the cracks of the pavement. She stood there for a long time, feeling the gentle breeze against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. And as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A faint, golden light flickered in the distance, just for a moment. It wasn't Lucas. It wasn't anything she could explain. But it was enough. Sophie walked away, her steps light, her heart open to whatever lay ahead. The red door, the mirrors, and the pain of the past were now a part of her story, but they no longer defined her. She had found the light within, and with it, the courage to embrace the infinite possibilities of tomorrow. Thank you for exploring this journey with Sophie.